Welcome along to the next hour of the Dairy Tech Online today. We've got a session now entitled The Farm Efficiency versus Sustainability Dilemma. I'm Robert Craig, your chair for this session, so dairy farming up in Cumbria and Northumberland. Tiny bit of housekeeping for those of you that may have just joined. Keep yourself on mute, and the best thing for you to do is to hide the other screen. So click on speaker view so you can just see who's speaking. Maybe that's what I've got wrong. Use the chat function if you want to ask a question, and then questions will come through to me. And also, if you're enjoying it and you want to tweet, stick hashtag DairyTech21 in there so that we can spread the word. The farming efficiency versus sustainability dilemma. We've talked a lot already today about net zero and how we're going to do this. And it's a huge challenge for a lot of dairy farmers, certainly is. 30, 35 years in the industry, it's become increasingly intensive no matter what system you operate, really. And that's largely driven by economics. We've seen dairy farmers' uptake of stewardship schemes pretty limited for various reasons, usually because it makes such a big impact on the business. But we're also seeing some of the aligned pools now and some of the co-ops certainly for offering more bespoke schemes, if you like, with bonuses attached on biodiversity and soils. So we're seeing some work now on dairy farms in addition to the limited amount on the sort of stewardship schemes. But I think we're all aware that stewardship has appeared right at the top of the agenda, and very rapidly as an industry we've got to adapt to this. So thinking about what Victoria Prentice said this morning, that we're entering a period of significant change, and in dairy specifically, she said. So with that in mind, we've got 4 speakers for you this afternoon. We've got Nick Major, the Director of Corporate Affairs for 4Farmers. Following Nick, we've got three dairy farmers who are going to give an overview of what they've implemented in their own businesses to make them more sustainable whilst remaining efficient. So we've got Tim Downs, Nuffield Scholar and RABDF Trustee, farming organically in Shropshire. We've got Dan Burdett, another recent Nuffield Scholar. I did a Nuffield Scholarship on the transition to regenerative agriculture. And also a newly awarded Cream Awards Organic Dairy Farmer of the Year. So well done, Dan. And we've got Neil Baker, another award-winning farmer, I think 2015 Gold Cup winner. Neil down there, so we'll have Neil on at the end then. Hopefully by the time we get through them, we should have 20 minutes or so left for a question and answer session or a bit of a discussion with me at the end. So without further ado, I'd like to hand you over to Nick Major, who will give the first presentation.
Thank you, Robert. It's great to be here. Thanks very much for the invitation. I just want to start by congratulating our ABDF on organising Dairy Tech Online. I think it's a great programme over the next 2 weeks, and I would say a great example of the innovation that's so inherent in the dairy industry. So the title of this session is Farm Efficiency versus Sustainability. It's a great title, and I think I would start by asking the main question, which is whether it really is either or whether we can't agree that to some extent efficiency is such an important part of the whole sustainability agenda. And I have to say we certainly do, and I'll explain that over the next few minutes or so. So probably I can explain that better in the context of our own sustainability strategy, given where we are in the supply chain, and I suppose our role as nutritionists and advisors. And although we updated our sustainability approach in September last year as part of our overall strategy, an important part of our overall strategy, sustainability has been one of 4Farmers' 3 core values for many years. So if I can change the slides. Which I can't at the moment. Okay. So let's put our sustainability into context. And we refer to our approach as going circular. And at its heart, it recognises the pivotal role that livestock production plays in sustainable food systems, as we set out in our definition. It's such an important element of our industry, the livestock industry and the feed industry. So let me run through how we define going circular. And I think definitions in circularity, in sustainability are...
What's done this market score?
Sorry, I'll keep going.
Sorry, Nick. If I could just remind delegates, please mute your microphones because it takes over the screen and we lose the speaker. Thank you. Sorry, Nick.
No, Robert. No problem at all. So yeah, just saying that defining sustainability, defining your scope within sustainability, defining circularity, I think is so important because there are so many different interpretations of sustainability and circularity depending on your perspective, your assumptions, and where you fit in the supply chain. But from our point of view, we have a clear definition, which you can see there, which I think plays to our strengths. And by our strengths, I mean the sort of livestock industry as well as the feed industry. So we start off with this central theme, which is to transform low-value materials into high-quality food. It's the central role that livestock production plays in sustainable food systems. I said on the previous slide, it mentions that there can be no sustainable food systems without livestock production. We truly believe that, and we will argue that strongly as the role that livestock has to play. And that role of livestock production in transforming low-value materials into high-quality food, of course, it starts with forage. It starts with the soil, it starts with forage, it starts with grass, it starts with the materials that are grown on farm. It recognises that ruminants are using land that in many cases cannot be used for anything else. And then if I think about my sector, the feed industry, we were founded on the use of co-products from primary food and drinks production and other industries. I think it's worth pausing and making a point here that in 2017, the FAO published a paper showing that globally 86% of feed materials consumed by livestock are not currently consumed by humans. This is so important in this sort of food versus feed type of, and maybe even versus fuel, but in this context, feed versus food debate and how we optimize land use going forward. So that use of co-products, byproducts, etc., is why we then include the second part of our definition, which is no waste of resources. And the third element there is zero pollution. So by that, we really refer to reducing emissions. So of course, greenhouse gases, nitrates, phosphates, because of the impact they have on climate change, soil and water quality, and biodiversity. And as already been mentioned in the last session, so important as we think about the transition, the journey towards ELMS. So it may be a fair question, and I do get asked this question as to whether suggesting that we can get to no waste of resources and zero pollution are really, realistic or achievable. And the answer is that's why we refer to going circular, because it's absolutely a continuous process. I would describe it as a journey, on which we embark. And yes, you'll see on the right-hand side, as part of the definition, we absolutely do refer to optimizing efficiency in the animal supply chain. So that's what we do include in our definition, but it's equally important that we explain what going circular is not, particularly when you're in this world of sustainability. It does not mean we will stop importing raw materials. It doesn't necessarily mean we will source everything locally. It doesn't necessarily mean that we will stop using soya per se, although like everybody will look at all the options there. It does not, of course, mean that we think small farms are more sustainable than large ones. Going circular, in our view, our approach to sustainability, the circularity approach to sustainability in general, does not force you or us to choose one production system over another, and it was referred to in the previous session, and I will come back to it again in a minute. It does mean, as a sort of market-orientated, customer-orientated business, that if there are supply chains that are looking for sort of particular characteristics, where they can create value, we will and do work within those supply chains. So that's our definition. We then express that in a framework which has three themes. I will go through this reasonably briefly from sort of the feed resources round. So we express it this way because feed resources, a very large percentage, I mean, it can be up to 90% of the carbon footprint of a ton of feed that we deliver to a farm is in the raw materials. So it's in the production, the processing and the transport of those raw materials that we use. So we need to be able to source responsibly and maximise the use of non-food materials. So that's the big percentage. If we go round to feed production, which is what we do, as it were, in terms of our own manufacturing and transport functions, that's the other 10% or so of the carbon footprint of a ton of feed delivered to the farm. And obviously, that's the bit that we have 100% control over. It's what we do. It's our own business. So we say we want to produce and supply with minimal adverse impact on the environment. I'm going to show some examples of what we mean in a moment or two. And then the feed solutions is, of course, the most important piece, really, which is how we help our customers reduce their own environmental impact. And the focus from our point of view here is on sharing knowledge and advice and to ensure a balanced use of resources in the total animal chain. There's two important points on this slide and the way we express it that I want to point out, and it does relate back to a discussion that was taking place in the previous session. I mean, first of all, of course, in a circular approach, they are all interrelated. So from our own point of view, of course, as a feed manufacturer, we could, of course, reduce the carbon footprint. We could choose lower carbon footprint materials. But if we then use more energy, which is, in the mills, for example, to manufacture them, then obviously you start to sort of reduce that impact. And I suppose perhaps more crucially here, we could reduce the carbon footprint of a feed that we supply to a farmer. But if that then lowers their own performance, then that could increase the total emissions per kilogram of milk, in this case, or meat or eggs. And that is why we refer to the total animal chain. The second point are those boundaries. So outside, there are boundaries to our three themes: environment, animal health and welfare, and people and society. And those are seriously important. And I think in the previous session, it was also described as a sort of the social license under which we all operate. And I think that's a really good way of describing it. And so, we all operate in various different production systems. And again, I refer to the previous session, where one of the speakers said, a good farmer is a good farmer. That is not dependent or related to the system of production that's used. So we have to be careful in these discussions, and whether it's either or, or black or white, or something is good, therefore something else must be bad. So, across sort of species, as it were, there is a demand for slow growing chickens. There is a demand for mandatory grazing periods, as just been described. In the UK, we have half our sows, outdoors. Now, depending on how you measure these things, there'll also be a debate about whether those systems have higher environmental impact than other systems. But ultimately, our view is, certainly from where we are in the supply chain, is society decides on the sort of production it wants to see. So in the end, we would argue, you have to continuously improve and optimize within those boundaries. So just to sort of come to a sort of a bit of a conclusion and just sort of explain, that's all sort of good in theory, and everybody's used to seeing strategy slides in PowerPoint presentations, of course. So what's important, of course, is that we actually make it happen, and we make a difference. So we've committed ourselves to a number of objectives for 2025 and ambitions for 2030. I suppose the reason for doing it in this way is that the objectives for 2025 are things that we really need to start doing now and working on and make happen over the next 5 years. And to some extent, they all contribute towards the sort of longer range ambitions for 2030, which are slightly broader. We and no one else actually yet has all of the answers as to how you get to solve some of these problems over a sort of 10 in this case 10 or so year timescale, let alone net zero by sort of 2040 or 2050. So just in terms of explaining this, we have sort of objectives and ambitions for each of our 3 themes that I've just described, but just in addition, because it's one of the it's the social license as it was just described. At the bottom there, we also have objectives and sort of metrics on health and safety and feed safety, because although they don't sort of fit neatly into a circular approach, they are qualifiers in the people and society boundary I mentioned a few moments ago. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but I want to pick out 2 or 3. I've already referred to the importance of our indirect emissions from raw materials, which is, if you like, is the feed resources elements of it. So like every organisation, of course, we need to reduce our own direct emissions as part of the transition to a low carbon economy. That's why we have an ambition to reduce our own emissions in production and transport by 70% by 2030. Known in the trade, as it were, as Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, and for example, by developing carbon neutral feed mills, which you'll see as an objective for 2025. But over and above that, there's a real interest in how companies like ours can reduce their indirect emissions, known as Scope 3, raw materials, as far as this sector is concerned. And that's why we include a number of objectives and ambitions in this area. So we do have an ambition to reduce our Scope 3, our raw material emissions, by 30%. And we can already provide carbon footprint, CO2 emissions for all of the raw materials that we use and all of the feeds that we produce. And this is so important in calculating, in a farmer being able to calculate their own carbon footprint. In livestock production, the carbon footprint associated with the feed that is used is quite a significant proportion of the total. So we see our role, at least at this stage, is to provide the information that a livestock producer requires to do their own environmental assessment by providing the information that they need on feed, rather than using sort of published data or published data or proxies for certain raw materials. And I would just make a plea, slightly on a sort of industry basis, as well as a for farmers one, is that when we get more and more into calculating emissions and carbon footprinting, that we use common methodology and database values in whichever carbon footprinting tool is being used, so that the numbers are sort of credible and comparable. And I promise you, I could go on for ages on this subject, but I won't. The reason I could go on for ages is that the feed industry has been doing a huge amount on this subject at a sort of industry level, UK, Europe, and on a global level, to establish, firstly, a common methodology for calculating the carbon footprints of feeds delivered to farms, known as the PEF, the Product Environmental Footprint Project, which is a European-based project. And then as a global feed industry, Europeans, the Canadians, the US, the Brazilians are also in establishing what's known as GFLI, the Global Feed LCA Institute. And this is effectively a freely available database of a huge number of feed materials and all of the emissions that are associated with those feed materials, so that anybody who wants to do a carbon footprint of feed or access that information in order to be able to do their own carbon footprint can access that information on a sort of free basis. So carbon footprinting, getting those emissions data, us helping to reduce our big chunk of scope 3 emissions right through to the farm is obviously so important as we develop all of our roadmaps to net zero, and as a sort of, just as an aside as it were, but an important one, as is how we calculate and value carbon sequestration in grassland. You know, I think that's just such an important part of net zero as far as you know, certainly the livestock industry and you know, dairy farming, etc., is concerned. We want to maximise the use of non-human edible feed materials, as I mentioned when I started, because they don't compete with food for land and tend to have a lower carbon footprint. So we will work on our percentage of, as it's defined by the FAO, the percentage of non-human edible feed materials in diets. And lastly, of course, but most importantly, you know, we'll continue to help our customers improve their efficiency in whatever production system they're using. So, you know, linking efficiency and sustainability to me is a win-win situation. So, you know, whether it's getting your heifers to calve at the right date or improving longevity of your cows, yeah, surely that must be the right thing to do economically, as well as reducing the environmental impact. So to conclude, Robert, you know, my view is, you know, efficiency and sustainability are in themselves not a dilemma, actually. And as is often said, you know, these days, I would see efficiency as being part of the solution and not the problem. So thanks for that. I'll hand back to you, and I'd be very interested to hear what the other speakers have to say on this subject. Thanks very much.
That's great. Thank you, Nick. It's really interesting to get the perspective from the feed industry side, and actually very reassuring that, you know, you're moving already towards a sort of common methodology. So that's really reassuring. It appears to me that you're ahead of certainly this side of the industry in that approach. We'll come back to your questions. So please, delegates, use the chat function to submit questions. We're going to move on to our first farmer speaker. So we've got Tim Dowes, farming an organic farm, or 2 organic dairy farms, I think, in Shropshire. Tim.
Thank you very much, Robert, and good afternoon to all the listeners far and wide, overseas as well, no doubt. So as Robert said, we've been organic now since 2000. We're very much into herbs and biology and all that goes along with that. We're spring block calving. We're just about to start calving at the moment. The first couple have started to calve today, and I've written a few notes and to add to what Nick was saying, big on responsibility, also interested in how elms fits in with everything as well, and hedgerows, ditches, walls, ancient buildings are all an important part and feature in our sustainability approach. We've been involved with agroforestry now for 5 or 6 years through the Woodland Trust, and that has a carbon message as well. And most importantly of all, our farming needs to be simple, repeatable and enjoyable, and ability to involve young people as well. Animal welfare is a huge part. We heard the last webinar cover that, and technology is crucial. And following on from that, the innovations that RABDF are keen to encourage, we're certainly party to as many of those that suit our organic farming system as we possibly can. Be that soil analysis, use of modern seed varieties, choice of breeds in our system is also crucial, and that helps to dictate which direction of travel we go in. And I'm certainly able to follow where my father was heading down the lower input route, but also trying to get high output out of a low input system. And efficiency, as was mentioned in the title, be that profit per animal or profit per area, I think you have to optimize the system for your own farm. And certainly benchmarking, we haven't done as much of that recently with the sort of stymieing of discussion groups. And as Die Wastenage certainly wants pubs to reopen, I think to add to that list would be good to have discussion groups reopening as well, as a real melting pot for ideas. And making sure that we're using our own resources as efficiently as possible. I don't see that they're mutually exclusive. We can be sustainable and profitable and efficient on farm. And something I'll just throw in as an addendum to finish, Tom Phillips always used to say, you've got to have some cow-free days. So we need to make our system so that we're not driving to the very edge of our ability. We are encouraging young people to involve themselves with the business and give them scope to improve and generate an involvement with our business. And we're also looking for examples at whether we can become more off-grid, whether we can involve solar energy more. We're already capturing a huge amount through photosynthesis, but can we capture an equal amount and store it in battery power and milk and cool milk through solar systems? So there's a huge amount, and it is really exciting time to be involved with dairy farming at the moment. So that sort of covers what we do, Robert. I'm sure we can open it up in questions later. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. You sound to me as if you're well ahead of the curve. I think it'd be really interesting to dig into how you managed to achieve that and actually making the changes you did all those years ago, 2 decades away. We'll move on to Dan Burnett. So Burdett, sorry. So congratulations first, Dan. I believe you were awarded the Cream Awards Organic Dairy Farmer of the Year this morning.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Yeah, I got home last night from work to find a package on the door. That was a nice surprise. So yeah, a bit of good news in the sort of gloomy winter is most welcome for sure. Yeah.
No, well done, and the floor's yours.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I can share my screen or not. It's saying I can't share my screen. I don't know whether anyone can let me do that. Just before I guess I've been given a slightly different remit. So I've recently completed my Nuffield Scholarship looking at regenerative agriculture. So I was going to talk very briefly about that and a bit about the farm here. I think I'll probably just wing it without any slides. So basically, we're a bit like the mirror image of Tim. We have 2 autumn calving organic farms down here in West Sussex and Kent, about 240 cows on each farm. We've been organic for 20 years and supply milk to Arla for McDonald's. So I run this farm here under a contract. My dad is the farmer and I'm the contractor. And the same sort of situation on the other farm where I'm the contractor for a big educational trust over in Kent. So we're firm believers in organic. We have recently started being a strategic dairy farm as well last year. Unfortunately, haven't had anyone on our farm, which is a bit like Tim as well, the same sort of thing, used to doing lots of webinars. I guess our big thing here for me is diversity. We've been growing herbal lays for about 6 or 7 years to pretty good success. It sort of opened my eyes really to what's actually possible. Let's see, share my screen now, I think. Okay, hopefully you can see that. So yeah, looking at herbal lays, about the sort of diversity and what that brings and mimicking nature. We just started planting some trees, hopefully in the next week or so, to do some silver pasture here as well. I really want to try and learn, more from the industry, get people on farm and tell us what's good and what's bad, and hear it from farmers themselves. So a bit about what is regenerative agriculture. It's a term that gets bandied around a lot at the moment. It's become very, very popular. There's lots of different ways of describing it. My favorite one is Robert Rodale. It talks about it being a holistic approach to farming that encourages continuous innovation, improvement of environmental, social and economic measures. So for me, it's not just about the soil, it's about the health and well-being of the farmer, those around them, their social environment, you know, basically a flourishing rural economy. For me, it's very farmer driven. I know there's a lot of organisations getting involved now, but for me, its roots are very firmly in farmer to farmer learning through this. So just give you a brief example, in America, just to show what it's capable of, a guy called Will Harris, who's a sort of multi-species farmer who's taking degraded cotton and peanut farmlands and regenerating the lands. He's built a huge slaughterhouse on the farm and now employs over 100 people over there, distributing across the United States. And he's plowing that money back into regenerating the town of Bluffton. So it kind of settles all of those, the economic side of farming, the environmental side and the social side. So I looked at the issues around change. I guess we're an industry where we can be stuck in our ways a bit. You know, we do what our previous generations did. Any change can bring about issues with social isolation. So you're trying to do something different and no one around you really understands it, and perhaps you struggle with that. You can end up losing confidence if what you try to do doesn't work out first time round. Perhaps you just go straight back to where you came from. A lot of people with regenerative agriculture read all the books and watched all the films and think they can change the world in 5 minutes. So that's just not possible when we're dealing with biological processes. So it's about making sure that we have attainable ambitions, you know, using SMART goals, make sure that it's achievable. And again, there's, you know, how do you check, how do you go from those ambitions to actually making it reality? You know, reading the book, how do you actually make it happen? The issues that sort of people become think it's a bit of a quasi-science. It needs a lot more research backing it up. Anecdotal evidence will get the people who are interested in it to go with it, but to get the mainstream of farmers, we need to have cold, hard data on the improvements in the economic and the environmental side of things. At the moment, there's not really much of a return in the marketplace for regenerative goods. Certainly if you're on a big scale commodity producer, it's just not there. There are some small examples, but not many. The main benefits economically really come from lowering your cost of production, particularly in the arable world, with less diesel, chemicals, etc. When we're talking about it, we need to make sure that we use the right language. I think it's been discussed on here a bit about, you know, there's no right or wrong way of farming. I think it's all about your own particular context. It does no one any good by kind of throwing stones at people on social media or wherever and casting aspersions, because we've all got a different starting point in life. The great thing about regenerative agriculture, probably a bit like this dairy discussion groups, is that people are very open to new ideas and are willing to talk to other people and tell them their stories openly and honestly, the good, bad and the ugly. So there's plenty of scope there to broaden it out, but there's no one size fits all. That's me. Thanks, Robert.
That's great. Thank you, Dan. That's really good. Thankfully, we got the technology working there towards the end. I'll hand you over now to Neil Baker from right down south. I would imagine it's a little bit more like spring in your part of the world today, Neil. It is pouring down in Cumbria and it's not pleasant at all, so it's quite nice to be inside. But interesting there, listening to Dan about planting trees. I think I had about 800 trees arrive since I've been sat up in this office this morning, so I think that's tomorrow's job. Neil, over to you.
Hello, good morning, afternoon, everybody. I've missed most of the morning. I've been on farm, so just caught the last bit of David's presentation. I was just going to give a brief description of what we do here in Somerset, and then on the topic, I've been trying to think of things going back to what Nick said earlier, actually, that sustainability nearly always goes along with efficiency. I was trying to think of some examples where that isn't the case. So I've just got a couple examples of things we've done which for sustainable reasons, but they're not necessarily efficient, should we keep doing them. And then a couple things that we're thinking of doing and reasons why we may or may not go down that route for the efficient or sustainable balance. So currently we farm about 2,000 cows, all fully housed, sand bedded, fairly standard sand cubicles. We do recycle all the sand. We make all our own power. We've got AD plant on site, and we throw off as much power as we use as well to the grid. We focus on high components. We're Arla farmers, so we try and produce high component milk. To that end, about a quarter of our herd now has some degree of Jersey blood in it. So that's something we've been doing the last 5 years. We make our own forage. We spread all our own manures. Farm about 2,700 acres in all now. Trying to push towards 60% homegrown feed if we can. We've always focused on low disease incidents to try and drive efficiency and sustainability. Most of the time we do that pretty well. So today we employ about 45 people on farm, 2 of which are my children and me. So they're now 5th generation in the business, dairy farming here in Somerset. And I think just going to nick a bit of Tim's presentation because it's a very different system, but his rules to live by are simple, repeatable and enjoyable. I think that is exactly what we do as well. So that's a background of what we do today. So the examples I was going to bring up is recycling sand actually. So we started recycling sand because sand's expensive. You know, at peak we were spending £250,000 a year on sand. It was a big input cost for us. So we go into it. So like the pros on the efficiency are it's cheaper. It's no longer in the manure if you take it out of the manure. So that's a definite bonus. The cons on being efficient are we do get a bit more disease, a bit more mastitis, a bit more lameness, because you just tend to end up with stones when you recycle sand. It's quite a complicated process as well. So on the efficiency side of sand recycling, we're still doing it. And we manage and we change things to try and limit the cons. On the sustainability side, it's very difficult to go against it. So the pros are obviously less transport, less quarrying, less dredging, depending on where your sand source is from. But the cons on sustainability are kind of the same cons as on efficiency, of more disease, higher replacement costs. So I just thought I was trying to think of examples that did that weren't necessarily all positive. And just interesting, going back to Nick's presentation as well on sustainable soya and palm oil sourcing. Now I'm starting to think, is that even a thing? And even if you can source it responsibly, should we be using it anyway? In my ration today, it's about 10% of my ration cost is half a kilo of soya and 200 grams of palm oil. But it's only about 2.5% of my dry matter. So if I replaced that dry matter with something which was a quarter of the cost, would I really notice it? And even if I did notice it, should I take it out anyway? Because I think that sort of social license thing, can you really explain to the consumer why you're feeding palm fat? You know, like I said before, we're trying to produce high component milk, and definitely the palm fat helps that. Can you really sit a consumer down and say this is a good idea when you could actually accept? Can we accept lose? I suspect if I take it out, I'll lose a litre or two, and I lose 0.1, 0.15 of fat. So I thought that's my big sort of efficiency versus sustainability debate at the moment that we're having internally. So they're my two sort of case studies, and I've got others, like the others that are in the melting pot now are stocking rates. You know, we've just built a new barn. Should we fill it up? You know, we're performing the best we ever have. Is that to do with understocking? You know, we know that cows perform less well when they're overstocked. So should we be understocking? But you know, say that in my discussion groups and they'll say you're mad. You just put up the barn, put a cow in the stall. But we all know, however good your stalls are, some of the stalls are not preferred. You can have as many cows as you like, or as few cows as you like, but some of the cows are going to be in an unpreferred bed. So that's a sort of, so that's me really, I think. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Neil. I will give Nick an opportunity to answer those questions you posed a little bit later on. But what I want to do is actually, I want to go back to something Tim mentioned actually. Well, a lot about where you started, Tim, and I think you've obviously been on an organic journey for a couple of decades. I'm intrigued as to how you defined what you needed to do at the beginning. Obviously organic and conventional, there's a big difference between, but how did you know then, and how do you know now actually what you need to do? I mean, I'm thinking specifically about what tells you is sustainable. You know, is there a tool that you use? Is there something out there that really drives the decision making? Because you've changed a bit with your agroforestry recently. You know, what was it that drove you in that direction?
Probably striving for new areas where we can concentrate on. The one reason we're in a trial with Harper Adams to look at medicinal features of willow, so salicylic acid and aspirin, and being somebody who likes to try and make it straightforward and simple, can we get the animals to actually graze it in situ rather than harvesting it? Although this year we have harvested it and we've got 5 or 6 trailer loads of willow hay that is interesting, and trying to feed and utilize that. So yeah, coming back to what Dan was saying as well, you're inspired by various different people, and I went across with 2 other Nuffield scholars to America to the Acres conference and learned a huge amount there about how they approach some of the difficulties within regenerative or organic farming, and we're trying to become as perennial as we possibly can, and not sort of move the soil unnecessarily, grow deep-rooted swards that will last for many generations to come, and harness solar power as much as we possibly can.
And a similar question to Dan actually, because Dan, you said we need some real hard data as to sort of tell us as producers, as farmers, what is regenerative. So how are we going to go about that? How would you go about that on your own farm?
Well, so I think I'm trying not to get too caught up on the carbon story. I think it's too simple, really. We're looking at sort of the pit in a round, I suppose, so biodiversity on the farm. So we had a wildlife survey done last year to look at what's here. I don't know, right from insects all the way up to birds. So we've got a baseline there. I think that's really important to me because that will show me whether I'm doing the right things outside of the farmyards. That's something that's just going to drive me pretty well. We need baseline soil statistics. I think I still struggle a bit with what soil sampling methodology and which tests we should use. We could spend an awful lot of money on soil samples, but again, it's about me getting some baseline figures this year, Robert, so that I know that if I'm doing something, I can see with my own eyes and with the data that it's working.
Thank you, Dan. And Nick, I'll let you come back on the soya and palm oil sustainability question, but also you mentioned, I think you called it PEF, the sort of common methodology that the feed industry is going to. So just explain a little bit about how the industry moved towards that situation.
Yeah, so I will come back to the soil one because it's a question that we're asked almost on a daily basis, to be honest. So on the PEF, so effectively, you know, and this starts with this starts with the European Commission several years ago. So I don't think that when I explain why, and I'm not sure the why is any different now that we're not inside the EU. Ultimately, what the policy driver behind it is to ensure that consumers, when they're making buying decisions, have the information they have to make informed choices. And so that includes at some point providing consumers with the environmental impact data somehow. And I'm not, labeling is seriously a complicated issue, but somehow providing consumers with the information they need on the environmental impact of what they're buying so they can make informed decisions. And it doesn't matter whether it's a bottle of water or a pair of shoes or a litre of milk. So this is not specific at all to agriculture. But if you are going to provide consumers with that information, then it has to be credible and based on a scientifically rigorous process, so that we don't get into sort of all sorts of claims that are made without the process behind them, and you sort of get into sort of greenwashing and all that sort of stuff. So the idea behind the Product Environmental Footprint Project was to put together a group of experts, get the industry together, do it together with the technical experts within the Commission, and we have the equivalent in the UK, to put together an agreed LCA life cycle analysis methodology, boundaries, scope, what the functional units are, all those sorts of things, so that effectively there is now a published method, agreed scientific method, which meets all of the sort of data, the required standards of how you calculate the carbon footprint of 1 tonne of feed delivered to the farm gate. So the point really is, hopefully, the driver is to provide consumers with that information so that the consumer starts sending signals to producers, who then start to innovate and start to look at how they can innovate and reduce their environmental footprint. But so that's where we should compete. What you don't want to be competing on is, well, I use this methodology and you use that methodology and yours is 100 and mine's 90, because we've used 2 different ways of calculating it. That doesn't get us anywhere. So that's the idea behind so just have an approved methodology. And the same is true really on raw material database values, so that people can use a standard set of values for wheat or soya, or from whichever origin it comes from, whichever country it comes from. So on the soya and palm oil question, it's absolutely a key question. So we're nutritionists, right? So we work by formulating diets on nutritional parameters. Soy, particularly more so for pig and poultry, but soy is a great source of certain nutrients, and so is palm oil. So our role, I think, is first of all to ensure that whatever soy and palm oil we're buying and using is used sustainably. I mean, if you look at deforestation, soy comes from the US, it comes from Brazil, it comes from Argentina. Deforestation isn't a problem in the US. Deforestation is a problem in some parts of Brazil, but not others. And deforestation is a problem in some parts of Argentina, but in others. So first of all, whatever we're using, let's make sure it's sourced responsibly. And responsible sourcing isn't just about deforestation, environmental, it's about a whole load of social and ethical and governance and legal and good agricultural practices. So the real answer to Neil's question is, our role then is to work with our customers who then say, do you know what, I understand that, but what are the options that I can look at so that I can take soya out? For whatever reasons, all those social, ethical reasons, and our role is to provide the information that a producer needs to say, okay, if we take soya out, this is what happens to the diet, this is what happens to the nutrition, keeping the nutrition the same, this is what happens to the cost, because by definition, if we're using soya, it's because it delivers the most economic cost for that set of nutrients. So we take it out, here's what happens to cost. And by the way, here's also what happens to the environmental impact, because you've got to replace it with something. So if you take soya out, what do you replace it with? And what are the environmental considerations for those raw materials that you're replacing it with? So if we provide producers with that information, then it's up to them. We're customer led. So if customer says, do you know what, I get all that, Nick. I'd rather take it out. Can you formulate the diet without? Then that's what we do. Because ultimately the customer decides. Our job is to provide the information they need to make an informed decision.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I've got a list of questions here, so I'm going to go to Neil now. Neil, around stocking rates, you know, what is your ideal stocking rate now, and the benefits of that? And I guess, you know, what would you give up if you had to reduce your, if you're not, you know, got to fully stock these sheds? What is the cost?
Well, I think the research on the stocking rates is critical for the pre-fresh and fresh cows, 85%, and we rarely go higher than that in those pens. I think historically we've always been a good 100% on the milking pens, but lately I think we've been more like 95s, and I think we are seeing reduced incidence of disease, reduced injuries. So I think, you know, Red Tractor says it's got to be, you know, a cow a bed. But my question in the forums and is, you know, how many beds are usable? You may have some beds, but how many beds are really usable? And I think we all need to be honest with ourselves. You know, like you were saying about your rain, and we had some torrential rain down here the last few weeks. Some of the beds by the doors, you know, they're no longer in the calculations. They're too wet. You know, and even if they're not wet, the cows don't want to lie in them. So where are your stocking rates on those days? So I think we all need to be, you know, you look at the, there's some research I saw, cows which lie in beds which are not preferable in the herd, they cud at 50% in a normal cudding. So they may be led down in the bed and they may be cudding, but they're not cudding as much. So if they're not cudding as much, they're not as efficient. So, and that's a perfectly acceptable bed. It's just in a place that the cows don't like. So I don't know if that answers that.
Yeah, no, I think with a question for Dan here around herbal lays. Are these grazing lays, Dan, or are they silaging, or are they both?
Both really. It started off with grazing lays. They tend to be longer term with a bit more diversity in them. Our cutting lays, we started putting a few herbs in there, some deeper roots, and also down here in the drought-prone southeast, trying to put some cocksfoot in there as well, a bit of timothy to try and get some deeper roots because the ryegrass just dies otherwise.
Yeah. Okay. There's a question here around economics, really, and you know, if we're heading towards net zero, or we've got to get to net zero. I mean, what will the industry look like the other side of all of this? Will it be that sort of high carbon milk has a lesser return? Lower carbon milk having a higher return? What would that mean for organic? And I'm going to go around you all on this actually, because we've got about 5 minutes left. And what will the industry look like in the next sort of 10 years or so, the other side of all this, or sooner? Tim.
Oh, crikey! Thanks for that laden one. The industry is certainly changing. We're very much going down, as Neil would be, the solids route, so breeding, but we're trying to breed an animal that we can look after within our capabilities. We'll graze, we'll get back in calve, as the previous presentation with Adam Butelaar. It was fascinating. Something that really made me chuckle was the fact that he and his wife are well over 6 foot and had a baby of 7 pounds, and met somebody else who was a foot shorter, had a baby that was 12 pounds in weight. It's not necessarily the weight, it's the actual genetic potential. So we'll be making a lot more use of genomics, of improving our animal suitability to the system, be that food conversion efficiency. We also did a trial with a Newcastle University lady about efficiency of animals, and it was the smaller animal that came out top of the pile. So weight being a significant reason why she was more efficient. She produced well, high milk solids, and got back in calf well. Yeah, there's a lot of things we'll be looking at, different plant species, and all sorts of different areas. But milk solids is one, solar is another, herbs, and soils. So I've just got my soil analyses in front of me now to go through, and yeah, it's something that is uppermost in the mind.
Thank you, Tim. You very nicely sidestepped the industry question there, but I'll pose the same question to Neil around the economics for your own particular enterprise, but also what do you think the industry will look like as we, you know, I've been at this 3 decades or more, and there are a hell of a lot less of us now than there was when we started. You know, is that a trend that will continue? What do you think?
I think it definitely will. Yeah, I think the halving of dairy farm numbers every 10 years is a pattern that's set, I would say. And all I can see coming at us is more challenges. You know, the balance, you know, who is going to stay in the game in tight financial situation, unknown compliance, you know, what is the Clean Air Act, what is ammonia emissions, what is dairy permitting going to throw at us? We've got ELMS coming at us, staff issues coming at us with Brexit. You know, we're largely Polish staff. It's not a simple picture, is it? I mean, I don't know, if I was sat here 20 years ago, would we have been forecasting getting down to 10,000 dairy producers? I'm not sure. I think the world was much more certain then. I think we're, you know, really uncertain times. So I cannot see there's just so many other options, aren't there, for farmers? We don't, you know, we're asset rich, that we have options. A lot of us do. So you don't have to, and that's what all the 25,000 dairy farmers have got out in the last 20 years. They're all still around, aren't they? They're all still doing something. And there are still always options for farmers, aren't there?
Thank you, Neil. I'll move on to Dan, and then we'll have a final word from our sponsor, Nick, at the end. Dan?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what Neil said there. I mean, from my perspective, it's kind of where the consumer and the retailers are going to be at. I know this has been a long-term trend about prices, but the demands from consumers who say one thing but then do another thing is a real challenge. You know, a lot of the data that comes out of market research says that consumers want high welfare, they want cows grazing, they want this, etc. They want farmers to jump through lots of hoops, but then they and the retailers are unwilling to pay any extra money for it. And I think, you know, milk prices are at a bit of a standstill. I'm not usually one to stand out with a placard, but our feed prices are unsustainable in the organic world. They're only going in one direction, and the more hoops we're asked to jump through, the more I question whether we're going to get the value back out of the market.
Great. Thank you, Dan. And to Nick, you've got about a minute.
Robert, I'm a natural born optimist, and I'm not going to change my outlook now. So I think that, first of all, the challenge is that as other industries, we all know this, as other industries decarbonise, then effectively the percentage of carbon that comes from you know, agriculture and livestock production goes up. So the spotlight is on us. But being the optimist, that means that we have to be part of the solution. And I think I'm seriously keen that we ensure that when governments talk about, you know, green recovery and, you know, build back better and everything, that, you know, they immediately default to electric cars and hydrogen and stuff, which I can understand why, but we need to make sure that they know, and we've mapped out, you know, what role agriculture and livestock production has in that, because I think it has an amazing role. You know, ultimately, you know, what we do is we put food on people's plates, and that's just an amazing thing to be able to do despite all the challenges. And so my optimism is based on the potential for science and innovation. I've always been told, you know, never bet against a scientist or an engineer, and for the last few hundred years that's served us well. So I'm working on the basis that it will for the next 20 or 30, and if I wear one of my other hats briefly, you know, CL, the Livestock Agri-Tech Centre, published a report recently on net zero carbon and livestock, and I'd recommend it to everybody. It shows how far we can already go, doing all the sort of things that my colleagues on the panel have already referred to. but we need to identify where those gaps are, and the sort of new technology that's coming down the line, I think will help us. So that's probably more than a minute, but I remain optimistic.
Great. I'd love to finish on an optimistic note. That was a very similar note to David Black, who rounded off his talk on the previous session, actually. So really good. Hopefully you've really enjoyed that session. Thank you to all of my speakers and also to 4Farmers for sponsoring this session. Hopefully you found it all useful.